Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Merowitz Center today. We've got a crowd today. Stephen, if you would like to go ahead and start the program, please.
Be happy to. Thank you very much, all of you, for joining us this morning for this very important conversation about a very important topic, the Pew Study. It's my pleasure to introduce to all of you Ben Sales, who reports on anti-Semitism and coordinates Israel coverage for the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. And no doubt he's had a pretty busy weekend with the change of government in Jerusalem this weekend. In recent weeks, Ben covered the conflict with Hamas in Gaza, as well as the recent wave of anti-Semitism in the United States. He also led JTA's coverage of the 2021 Pew Research Center survey of Jewish Americans, reporting on the study's overall findings, along with its data on intermarriage and American Jewish attitudes toward Israel. From 2012 to 2016, Ben was based in Tel Aviv as JTA's Israel correspondent, reporting on Israeli politics, culture, security, and religion, as well as broader Middle Eastern affairs. He was part of the team behind The New Jew, an Israeli documentary on American Jewry. He has reported from 10 countries on 4 continents. He now lives in New York City with his wife and son, and I would be very remiss if not I didn't share with all of you that he is a graduate of Washington University, so he really is one of us. Ben, thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. Like Stephen said, I'm a very proud graduate of WashU in 2009, which for me feels like a long time ago. But I have very fond memories of WashU and just a lot of love for the St. Louis community, Jewish community, which was very welcoming to me and my friends when we were at WashU in many ways. So I'm very happy to be here with you virtually. I'm sorry I can't be there with you in person. God willing, that will happen one day because I would love to make it back to St. Louis. But I'm really happy to be speaking with you all about this wide-ranging topic. So I'm going to speak for a bit about the 2021 Pew Study on American Jews, which covers, like I said, a broad array of subjects relating to American Jews and the way we live and how we exist in the world. And then really, I'd love for the bulk of it to just be your questions. And I, of course, have notes. I've done a bunch of coverage of this. But as you ask, just in advance, I ask you to forgive me as I refer back to the study here and there to make sure I'm getting numbers right, because I don't want to, I don't have every single number in my head, and I don't want to get something wrong and provide a mistaken impression of anything. I will also say that given the news out of Israel yesterday, in case you didn't hear, Benjamin Netanyahu is no longer Israel's prime minister. For the first time since I was at WashU, by the way. He became prime minister when I was a senior in college, and I am now a parent with a mortgage in New York City, and he is no longer prime minister. So I understand it's a bit off topic from what we're talking about, but if people have questions about that at the end, I'd also be happy to give a little spiel about that. I also, my final apology is that I'm a bit under the weather today. I don't know if you can hear it in my voice. So I'm going to be drinking a lot of water, and I may cough and sniffle here and there, but I hope to keep that to a minimum. That being said, let's get into the Pew Study. So a bit of background on this. So the Pew Research Center is a really robust organization that does surveys on a lot of religious topics, but a lot of topics generally. As you can tell by their name, Pew, the reason they were founded, and like their raison d'etre, is studying religion and providing survey data on a broad array of religion topics and the way religion and politics kind of intertwine, religion and current events. And in 2013, they released their first wide-ranging study on American Jews. And that was really a bombshell in the American Jewish community at the time. I think that for For one, it kind of gave dimensions and a lot of data to ground the way American Jews lived. And so it acted as this all-purpose reference point for anyone who wanted to talk about the American Jewish community. And it also provided a lot of data that I think in some cases shocked or troubled or pleased a lot of people. So, it showed just, we're not talking about that one, but just to give a brief overview of that one, it showed that the vast majority of Jews were proud to be Jewish, identified as Jewish. It also showed that intermarriage rates were rising in the Jewish community. That is, young people, young Jews, the majority of young Jews were marrying non-Jewish partners. It also showed that the conservative and reform movements were shrinking, and that young people were less affiliated with those movements than they had been in the past. And there were a variety of other data. That one also showed that Holocaust remembrance was particularly important to a broad swath of American Jews, kind of across categories. I will say that, so when we looked at the 2020 survey that came out this year, the data was taken in 2020 and released this year in 2021. The way I like to talk about it is that everything is different and everything is the same. So just to start out talking about what's the same, the Pew study in 2013 found rising intermarriage rates, and the Pew study this year found rising intermarriage rates. That is, young people, the majority of them are still marrying non-Jewish partners, young Jews. The Pew study in 2013 found that the conservative and reform movements were shrinking, and so did this one. The Pew study in 2013 also found that young people considered Israel less important than their parents, than older generations, and this one, that's also the case. But really, what's interesting to me are the ways in which this one is different and has a lot of data points that either expand on or, to me, provide kind of wrinkles and nuance to things that we thought we already knew about the Jewish community. So I wrote an article called The Pew Study Cheat Sheet, which tried to take this 200-page study that came out earlier this year and boil it down to 10 key points. And I'm going to kind of go through those, but really I'm going to focus on the three areas that I just referred to: intermarriage, Israel, and kind of Jewish affiliation or attachment. I think that that's where the most interesting data is to me, and that's where things kind of changed, or where the data changed in ways that are interesting. But first, just a little bit of basics. The study found that there are 7.5 million American Jews. As of today, as of this year, that's still the largest Jewish population in any country anywhere. Israel has more than 6 million Jews, but not quite the 7.5 that America has. And that includes about 5.8 million adults and 1.8 million children who are Jewish. And for those of you who are good at some back of the envelope math, that number adds up to 7.6. But because of rounding, the number is 7.5 with those kind of subsets. And most of those adults identify themselves as Jewish by religion. That means they consider themselves affiliated with a religion, and that religion is Judaism. The rest of the adults, which would be about 1.6 million, call themselves, well, they don't call themselves this, but Pew calls them Jews of no religion, which means it's what we might have called in earlier years secular Jews or cultural Jews, Jews who really aren't religious at all and don't do religious things, don't think about themselves in religious terms, but are Jewish. And on a personal note, a great example of this was my college roommate at WashU, who grew up in kind of a secular Yiddishist family in New York City, very Jewish culturally, listened to Jewish music, to kind of old Yiddish music, his parents are active Jewishly in the workers' circle and kind of other older Jewish organizations, but he was an atheist, not religious at all, never really did anything religious. And when my newswire, the newswire that I work for, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, wrote an article last month about Jews of no religion, he's actually one of the people they interviewed because I was connected with him. So that's kind of a good case study of what a Jew of no religion is. And of course, they didn't ask Jewish children whether or not and how they affiliated, because children are children, of course. And I think all of our identities are constantly in flux, but theirs is particularly, obviously. So I think those are kind of some population basics. Now let's get into the three areas that I talked about. So let's talk first about intermarriage. So this study found that intermarriage rates are particularly high. I believe that it found that 61% of Jews who got married in the past decade, that is from 2010 to 2020, married non-Jewish partners. So that's really, I'm 35. That's really me and my kind of micro generation, my cohort of Jewish peers. 61% of us married non-Jewish partners. That's similar to the 58% that the study in 2013 found, and this study also found that nearly 3/4 of non-Orthodox Jews who have gotten married since 2010 have married non-Jews. By contrast, among Orthodox Jews, intermarriage remains quite rare. Very low numbers. I believe it's single digits, low single digits. Those numbers really haven't changed over the past 7 or 8 years. But, and this is a big but, most intermarried couples are still raising their kids Jewish. The majority are raising their kids primarily as Jewish. That's their primary religious identity. And another 12% are raising them partly Jewish by religion. So that's like part of their religious identity. That means, taken together, that about 2/3 or even a little more of children of intermarried couples are being raised either primarily Jewish or partially Jewish. And I actually wrote an article about this, and the couples I spoke to all said, we see something really valuable in Judaism, especially because it's a minority religious identity in the United States. They want to keep it alive. They find meaning in it. They also find, by the way, that a lot of Jewish spaces are kind of understand intermarriage and have found ways to accommodate them, which might not be the case with Christian religious spaces. And also, we live in an era where kind of having an ethnic identity or kind of minority religious identity other than just American is something that people look for in certain ways, especially kind of people that live in Jewish spaces. So this is kind of a way that people have found to grab onto a unique identity that they can perpetuate. And so that's happening. And a lot of people told me that they want this and they want kind of spaces for Jewish life and spaces where, as intermarried families, they can still live Jewishly. And I think it's not for me to tell Jewish organizations or religious spaces, synagogues, what to do, but that's certainly a thing that that I think is happening. That at least non-Orthodox Jewish communities are becoming more accommodating in certain ways to intermarried couples. So the second kind of, speaking of that, the second kind of area I just wanted to touch on was denominational affiliation, Orthodox versus conservative versus Reform. And what this study found, it was striking to me that the future that this study sketches out, the 2021 study sketches out, is one of religious polarization. I think, we live in a polarized society in many ways, certainly in terms of politics. Excuse me one moment. Certainly in terms of politics, and also in terms of religious identity. So that means that, if you look at the raw percentages of conservative and Reform and Orthodox Jews, they haven't really changed. I believe, here's the data I can read to you. So, about a third of American Jews identify as Reform. A little less than 1/5 of American Jews identify as conservatives. About 10% identify as Orthodox, and the rest, about another third, identify as unaffiliated or don't have a branch of Judaism. So those numbers haven't really changed over the past decade or so. What has changed is if you look at the numbers between generations. So whereas I believe about a third of I'll tell you, right. So more than a third of I got that wrong. About a quarter of older American Jews identify as conservative. That is, I believe, 65 and older. But if you look at at young adults, at adults under 30, only 8% identify as conservative. So that's 1/3 of the number of older adults. Just to put it more succinctly, the percentage of younger Jewish adults who identify as conservative Jews is 1/3 of the percentage of older adults who identify as conservative Jews. And I'm sorry, by the way, if this jumble of numbers has become confusing. I hope we can sort through some of the confusion if there is any during the Q&A. On the opposite kind of spectrum, among adults under 30, so that's ages 18 to 30, or 18 to 29 actually, 17% are Orthodox, and I believe 40%, about 40% are unaffiliated. So again, it appears to me to be polarization, right? The Orthodox is growing among young people, the unaffiliated group is growing among young people, and the conservative and Reform group, which used to make up the vast majority of American Jews, is shrinking. So that to me was very interesting. Another interesting kind of set of numbers regarding Jewish identity has to do with Jewish diversity. And I'll just take a step back here and say that a lot of what this study did, and a lot of where the new information came in, came when the study asked about issues and kind of movements that have changed American society over the past few years. So when it comes to Jews, the two things the two new areas that it really had were asking about anti-Semitism, which I think, as we all maybe know or feel, has grown in America over the past several years. Statistics certainly show that. And the second area where it really asked a lot more questions was in terms of racial and ethnic identity. The term that younger Jews kind of use for that is Jews of color, like people of color. This survey didn't ask about that term, but it did ask Jews how they identified racially, how they identified ethnically, and how they identified in terms of national origin, where they're from, where their parents are from. That set kind of painted two interlocking but different pictures. On the one hand, the vast majority of Jews in America identify primarily as white. 92% of American Jews identify primarily as white. But among young people, among Jews under 30, 15% identify primarily as not white. So that includes people that are interracial, right? That have maybe one white parent and one non-white parent, but they might identify primarily as not white. So 15% is a big number, just for context, that's a bigger number than the number of Orthodox Jews in America, right? So 15% identify primarily as not white, and another thing is, I believe 17% identify either as not primarily white, not Ashkenazi, or their parents immigrated from, a non-European country. So just to summarize that whole set of numbers, what that shows us is that the Jewish community still identifies mostly as white, but the number and proportion of non-white Jews in America is growing in a bunch of different ways. The last thing that I'll talk about is Israel. And I think that this is particularly interesting. It was particularly interesting to me as all of this news from Israel came out over the past month. In terms of the scheduling of this study, it was kind of unlucky for Pew, because the study came out on the same day that the conflict over Gaza started. So at JTA, for example, at my publication, we had this whole plan to cover the Pew study and kind of publish a set of articles. And then it all got upended because that same day we had to shift all of our resources to covering the Gaza conflict. And I think that was the case at a lot of places. But what it also did for us was that it gave us an opportunity to delve a little deeper into how American Jews feel about Israel. So again, one moment. As was the case with racial and ethnic identity, I kind of view the Israel numbers as a bit of a blank slate. So whatever opinions you already had about the way American Jews relate to Israel can be confirmed in the Israel numbers. That is to say, for people that value a strong American Jewish relationship with Israel, there's a lot here to reassure that. A majority of American Jews, the vast majority, say that caring about Israel is an important or essential part of their Jewish identity, of being Jewish. And that's true across denominations, across age groups, across a broad array of kind of subcategories. So young people, Orthodox people, older Orthodox people, younger non-Orthodox people, everybody says, the majority say that caring about Israel is important or essential to their Jewish identity. And most American Jews feel emotionally attached to Israel. And I'll just say, as an aside, that I think that these numbers are a much better measure of the way American Jews relate to Israel than the terms pro-Israel or anti-Israel. Because when you talk about that, you often talk about politics. And when you get into politics, the picture is a lot more complicated. And of course, Israelis, as we've seen over the past few weeks, have a wide range of opinions about their own politics. But what the survey does show is that the majority of American Jews, again, across a broad range of categories, has an affinity for Israel, cares about Israel, feels attached to Israel, says caring about Israel is important to them as Jews. So I find that to be a much better kind of marker of the way American Jews relate to Israel. Another interesting thing is that nearly half of American Jews have been to Israel. Decades ago, 30, 40 years ago, that certainly wasn't the case. Now it is. And part of that is the ease of travel, and part of that is birthright. So among Jews who were aged 25 to 34, 1 in 4 have gone on birthrights. 25% have gone on birthright. So birthright was a big part of this kind of jump in American Jews going to Israel. And another thing that I found interesting is that about 60% of American Jews said they have some or a lot in common with Jews in Israel. And I'm not going to run down all these numbers, but if you asked each kind of denomination of American Jews, they found that they had more in common with Israeli Jews than with kind of a denomination that wasn't theirs. So just to give an example, if you Reform Jews, a larger percentage of Reform Jews said they had a lot in common with Israeli Jews than with American Orthodox Jews. If that doesn't make sense, then I'll try to explain it later. And the same is true with Orthodox versus Reform. Orthodox Jews in America feel they have more in common with Israeli Jews than with American Reform Jews. Now, if we get into politics, kind of, or really, opposition to Israel, that's more kind of core and essentialist. A big number that jumped out to me is that 10% of American Jews say they support BDS, the movement to boycott, divest from, and sanction Israel. Among Jews under 30, that number rises to 13%, which in terms of surveys isn't that big of a rise, because there are margins of error. So those numbers actually aren't that different. But the big number here is that 10% of American Jews say that they support BDS, support the movement to boycott Israel. Obviously for people that value a strong American-Jewish relationship with Israel, that is not good news. The last thing I'll say about that, and I think the last thing, because we're nearing the half-hour mark here, the last thing I'll say about that is that in, I think, the American Jewish popular imagination, colleges have universities, campuses, have become hotbeds of anti-Israel activity and BDS, boycott activity. And something I found very interesting in this study is that just half of American Jews under 30, so that is people in college or recent college graduates, just half of them have even heard much about BDS at all. Half of them haven't really heard of it. So that to me was interesting. That certainly there is considerable anti-Israel and anti-Zionist activity on campus. I'm not saying anything different from that, but it is interesting to me that a large proportion of Jews who either are on campus or were just on campus haven't really heard much about this. So I think it might be a little less pervasive than some of the news coverage suggests. Having said all of that, and I hope that at least some of that was clear, I'd love to answer some questions.
So Ben, there's a couple in the chat, and is there, from Jerry, he asks, is there any tracking of how many non-Jewish spouses convert to Judaism? And how about the Jewish spouse converting to his or her religion?
That's a good question. So in tune, I think, with the way most American Jews think about conversion, if a non-Jewish spouse converts to Judaism, that's not an intermarriage. That's a Jewish marriage. That person is a Jew. And likewise, for the purposes of this study, if somebody said their religion was something other than Judaism, let's say somebody said, I was born of Jewish parents and raised Jewish, but I converted to Christianity, they don't count as a Jew for the purposes of this study. So those people would not have been counted in the study. So I can't really give you numbers regarding that. What I can say is, and I'm not going to give specific numbers here because it would take a while to kind of find them, but there's actually a bit of a dip in intermarriage statistics, in recent intermarriage statistics, in a certain sense, between this study and the one in 2013. And the way Pew explained that to me was that it's possible that was because some people converted to Judaism. But again, it's also because the methodology was different, the way they asked questions was different, and the medium in which they asked questions was different. Like some questions were asked in online surveys versus telephone versus written responses. And so it's really good not to compare specific numbers, but the short answer is yes, there are certainly people who do convert to Judaism. And according to Pew, those would be considered fully Jewish marriages.
The next question is from Paul. Are non-white Jews primarily Orthodox or Reform conservative?
That's a good question. I can look that up, but I'm not I'm not positive. I don't think there were major I don't think there were major kind of shocks in denominational affiliation. I will say that because it's such a small number, and this is a good thing to keep in mind for surveys in general, because it was such a small number, it's hard to track questions like that. Like, because you're already dealing with such a small subset of American Jews that accurately tracking their denominational affiliation becomes a little harder because, one answer can kind of throw off the statistics. If you're talking about, let's say, 300 people versus 3,000 people, right? There's a lot more kind of room for error in how you parse the numbers. So that's something to keep in mind. I can certainly try to scroll through that offhand. I'll say that I don't have those exact numbers in front of me, but I do know that there really wasn't a there wasn't kind of a shocker in terms of denominational affiliation there.
So do we have another question? We don't have any more in the chat. Does anyone have some more questions, comments? There's a lot of information, Ben,
Yeah.
to process, I am thinking.
May I
I
ask-
do. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Please, someone was ahead of me. Go.
Okay, this is Betsy Schmidt from the Jewish Light. And I'm
Hi.
wondering, in terms of, you said that the majority of Jews said caring about Israel is important to their identity. And it's not politics, obviously, but do you have any more information about what that means, what that does mean to people?
So I think that they purposely left that question vague because it can mean a lot of different things. I know that large percentages of respondents, said that they have listened to Israeli music or watched Israeli films. Maybe not a majority, but a significant percentage of respondents. Obviously, like I said, about half have been to Israel in one form or another, and a significant percentage have been there more than once. If you just hang on one moment, I can tell you that. A large percentage. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but a large percentage have been there more than once as well. And people follow news about Israel closely as well. There's a large percentage that follow news about Israel. So those things to me all suggest kind of a variety of ways of connecting to Israel. I'm going to read you a line I wrote, which I think kind of answers this more clearly, which is that most American Jews feel some emotional attachment to Israel, follow news in Israel, and say they have something in common with Israeli Jews. That's a majority for all those things. So again, it might not be supporting Israel, this policy of Israel or another, but it does, it does demonstrate an attachment to Israel and a connection in one way or another.
Next question is from Paul again. Did you see differences in support for Israel by political affiliation? Yes.
Republicans are more supportive of Israel than Democrats, for sure. That's true. They display higher levels of support. They displayed higher levels of support also for Netanyahu, who, like I said, until yesterday, had been Israel's prime minister. And they have obviously, I think, kind of corresponding to that, lower levels of support for BDS. Yes, Republicans are more supportive of Israel, depending on what that means, than Democrats.
Even did you?
Also, I will say older Jews, I think this is important, right? A majority of Jews of all stripes, like I keep saying, feel an attachment or say caring about Israel is important or essential to them. Those numbers consistently go up when it comes to older Jews, and and they also consistently go up as you go from Reform to Orthodox. So older, just to kind of put it maybe a little glibly, older Republican Orthodox Jews would tend to be like the most attached and most supportive of Israel, whereas younger unaffiliated Jews would tend to be less supportive. Although, like I said, I think when you kind of parse the numbers differently, it paints a more textured and I think accurate picture.
So
Stephen?
Ben, based on this data that you shared, that a large number of the younger people who are affiliated identify as Orthodox, and that population tends to be more supportive of the Republican Party. What does that mean for the traditional relationships that have characterized the Jewish Democratic Party kind of connection? And what are the implications in terms of that for support for Israel?
Right. So that's a very good set of questions. And thank you for asking that. I want to emphasize that, yes, the Orthodox share of the population is growing as you move to younger people. Like I said, Jews under 30, 17% of them identify as Orthodox versus 10% in the entire subset. So yes, a larger percentage of younger people are Orthodox, but it's still a fraction, right? Most younger Jews, most Jews under 30, still identify in one way or another as non-Orthodox. And I'll say that kind of the same thing with politics. Yes, Orthodox Jews, I believe 75% of Orthodox Jews, according to the survey, identify as Republicans. But if you look at the big picture of American Jews, the vast majority still identify as Democrats or Democratic leaning. That's 71%, right? So 71% of all American Jews identify either as Democratic or they lean Democratic. And the picture is kind of flipped with Orthodox Jews, where the vast majority of them identify as Republicans. But again, you're still talking about a small percentage of American Jews overall. So, I think when you look at the way Jewish political affiliation is going and the way attachment to Israel is going, yes, like I said, Orthodox Jews do tend to be more attached to Israel, and that kind of dovetails, that dovetails with the Republican affiliation, and it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. Do they identify more with Israel because they're Republican, or do they identify as Republican because they sense that that's a safer home for them in terms of how they support Israel? And I kind of think it's both. I think it's kind of a mutually reinforcing process. But the big picture, like I said, is that I think even 20 years from now, most American Jews are still not going to be Orthodox, and most American Jews are going to identify in one way with the Democratic Party, and most American Jews are going to feel some form of affinity with Israel. If we look at the numbers now, I'll say another thing. I was talking to somebody who works in the Israeli government recently. And I was talking to them really about this question. We were talking about the recent conflict in Gaza, and as some of you may have seen, there were a lot of kind of mass anti-Israel protests in the streets during the war, which was something that we didn't see as much in previous rounds of conflict. And I asked this person, who I'm purposefully keeping anonymous because the conversation was off the record, but I asked this person, are you worried about the fact that younger Americans in general and younger Jews seem less attached to Israel than their parents? And this person told me, yes, but also if you look at the numbers, as people get older, they tend to identify with and support Israel more. And this person said, if you look at surveys from the early 90s, which at this point was 30 years ago, young people then also displayed lower levels of support than their parents. And then as those same people got older, they became more supportive of Israel. So I don't think that the past necessarily predicts the future, but it is possible that the young people now who don't support Israel or who feel less attached to Israel will themselves become more attached as they grow older.
We have another question from Nadine. As we know, being supportive of Israel can mean many things, including being critical of some policies and actions. How does this viewpoint and perspective take different religious perspectives into account?
I'll answer I'll try to answer that question the way I understand it. So this study, I'm not sure it asked directly, like, do you support Israel but criticize its policies? I do know that a good thing about American Jews and American Jewish organizations is that they conduct a lot of studies. And so there have been previous studies of this sort, I think from the American Jewish Committee, and also other organizations that have asked kind of versions of this question. And the big picture that emerges there, and I'm really trying to stay away from specific numbers because I don't want to fill, I don't want to make this too confusing. But the majority of American Jews say that they support Israel and criticize some or a lot of its policies. So that means, again, supportive and critical. And I think that reflects a lot of American Jews, by the way, from right and left. I know that it's been a long time since Israel has had what you could characterize as a left-wing government. The current government, the one that was just installed, is certainly more centrist than previous ones. But I remember, in the early 2000s, when Israel had governments that were kind of moving to the left or were more left-wing than they are now, I heard a lot of dissent from right-wing Jews. And over the past decade or so, Israel has had a succession of right-wing governments, and there's been a lot of dissent from Jews who are on the left vis-a-vis Israel. And so I think, just throughout the past couple decades, the idea that people are supportive of Israel as a Jewish state, as a Jewish homeland, feel a connection to the people of Israel, that's true. And also, they're critical of some or a lot of Israel's policies, depending on where you stand politically. I hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, I'm happy to try again.
Paul has another question. How does religious affiliation among Jews compare with that of other faiths? Example, Christians and Muslims. What are the trends over time of affiliation rates by faith?
Yeah, that's a good question. And as we, so I'm glad as you were asking the question, I was able to find the statistic here. Jews broadly are less religious than Americans overall. Fewer of them, 21% of American Jews, for example, say that religion is very important to them. That's compared to 41% of Americans overall. About a quarter of American Jews say that they believe in the God of the Bible. That's compared to a majority of Americans overall. So a majority of Americans believe in the God of the Bible versus a quarter of American Jews. And American Jews also go to services less often, and I believe they also study the Bible less often. Of course, that I don't think is the best comparison, because studying the Bible kind of plays different functions in Jewish and Christian life. But yes, broadly speaking, American Jews are less religious than Americans overall. Comparisons to Muslims are difficult because so few there are very few American Jews to begin with. We're like 2% of the population, and American Muslims are about 1%. So again, when you're talking about numbers that small, it's difficult to compare. I will say that that I know fewer American Muslims are intermarried than American Jews. So intermarriage rates are higher among American Jews than they are among American Muslims, although that doesn't necessarily speak to religious practice. One more thing I'm going to say about religious practice, and this isn't exactly what you asked, but something that kind of emerged from this study is that there are a lot of different ways to define what counts as religious practice and what doesn't. So, for example, going to a Pesach Seder, going to a Passover Seder, I think everybody would count that as a religious ritual, or lighting candles on Friday night, or lighting Hanukkah candles on Hanukkah. Those are things that kind of everybody defines as religious practice. What about cooking Jewish foods? What about reading Jewish books or watching Jewish movies? Things like that. I think that in the past, those may not have been defined as religious practices. But there's an interesting op-ed that we ran, an interesting opinion piece that we ran around the Pew study by Rachel Gross, who's a professor who studies this. And she basically argued that all those things, all those kind of cultural things I mentioned, should be seen as religious practice, because it's a way that American Jews, who might not be like traditionally religious, are still connecting to their heritage and connecting to Judaism. So I'm not going to read that whole thing to you, but I urge you to try to find it, because I found it to be a very interesting essay.
May I ask you another question, please?
Sure.
What in your conversations with your colleagues and your peers, has there been a discussion about the implications of the kind of level of identification with what that means for the traditional organizations of the Jewish community and their historic almost dependence and reliance on an assumption of Jewish values and Jewish priority, but driven by religion and other values that seem to be questioned in the study?
Yeah. So certainly, and this isn't a new thing from this study. Jews are identifying progressively less with what we might call traditional institutions, be they synagogues or federations or things like that. And I know that that to a certain subset of American Jews, that doesn't sound like a good thing, because those organizations really provided an anchor for a lot of American Jewish life historically, and currently, today, at this moment as well. And I think that those organizations do a lot of things that that a lot of American Jews don't think of in terms of sustaining kind of social services and things like that. I will say that although fewer American Jews, especially younger American Jews, donate to their federations or affiliate with them or things like that, an interesting thing that emerges from these studies is that they drive new forms of organization and new forms of activism. So my colleague, an editor of mine named Andy Silo Carroll, wrote about this, that in previous studies like this have really driven the way Jewish organizations spend their money. So surrounding the 2013 Pew study, which showed that a lot of younger American Jews found meaning in kind of social justice and in Jewish values of fairness and equality, there were a lot of kind of organizations that popped up or that grew to address that. One of them that comes to mind, though certainly not the only one, is called Repair the World, which is really something that says, okay, you're Jewish, you believe in social action and helping your community. Let's do that in a Jewish way and kind of do that as Jews together. I think another thing that comes up is with the rising intermarriage rates. people aren't throwing up their hands and saying, okay, we're going to lose these people to Judaism forever. They're saying, okay, let's find ways to engage them. So, I'm not trying to like plug one organization or another, but an organization that was founded out of that, just to give an example, is something called Honeymoon Israel, which at least before the pandemic would take intermarried couples on kind of like a birthright style trip to try to connect them to Jewish identity and to Israel. So again, like traditional organizations, I think are finding less support and affiliation, but that doesn't mean that Jews aren't organizing and affiliating. They're just organizing and affiliating in new ways that kind of speak to how they live.
I think that there are no new questions in the chat. Does anyone else have another question? We might be close to the time, so we'll have time for another question. If
I see somebody just, how does the percentage of Jews of no religion, I just saw Paul Kravitz posted, compare in 2020 to 2013? It's bigger. It's bigger. I don't have the exact numbers. I believe it's a little bit bigger. So that's growing. And again, particularly among young people, the percentage of Jews of no religion is higher than among older Jews. So that's certainly a part of kind of the Jewish future. But what I'll say is, again, just to reiterate, the fact that those Jews don't identify with a movement or don't even identify as as religious Jews in any way doesn't mean that they're not connecting to Judaism in certain ways. And I think, in terms of some of the stuff I just talked about and some of the more cultural rituals that I talked about, that's certainly a way that those Jews connect. And one more thing I'll say is I always found that what Jews consider essential to being Jewish is always really interesting to me. So, for example, the study asked a series of questions of like, okay, what is, here are a bunch of choices of things that you could consider essential to being Jewish. And what this study found is that 76% of American Jews, which anyone who knows Jews knows that when 76% of us agree on anything, it's a miracle. So 76% of American Jews said remembering the Holocaust is essential to being Jewish. 72% said leading an ethical and moral life is essential to being Jewish. A majority also said that working for justice and equality in society is essential to being Jewish, right? And on the opposite spectrum, only 15% said that observing traditional Jewish law is essential to being Jewish, right? So, I think that those kinds of things speak to Jewish priorities. And, if you want to talk about Jews of no religion, right, like, obviously almost none of them think that observing Jewish law is essential to being Jewish, but 63% say remembering the Holocaust is essential. That's a pretty solid majority, right? About half say that working for justice and equality is essential to being Jewish, or leading an ethical life, right? So, excuse me. So again, like, I think Jews of no religion, like, it's an interesting category. It's a way that Pew chose to define people. I don't think there's any Jew in the world who you're going to walk up to and they're going to say, "Hi, I'm a Jew of no religion." Right? Like, that's just not a term people use. They might say, like I said, they might say, "I'm a secular Jew, I'm a cultural Jew, I'm just Jewish." But that doesn't mean they're not expressing their Judaism in some way in their life, and that they don't think about being Jewish in some way. I'm going to refer back to my friend who I have a deep love for. He said, I think about being Jewish every day. Does that mean that he observes Shabbat? No, but he thinks about being Jewish every day. So I think that yes, the category Jews of no religion is growing, but that doesn't mean that these people aren't Jewish or actively Jewish or consciously Jewish in some way. A lot of them are in many ways.
I think we're probably close to the time. Do we have any more questions, comments? Stephen, would you like to take it from here?
Yeah, I would just like to say that it's too bad this was only an hour. There's so many questions still to be asked and thoughts to be processed. But thank you so very much, Ben, for putting the study into some context, for helping us to understand it a little through your analysis. Thank you for your thoughtful responses to the questions. And thank you, all of you, for joining us today for this presentation. This is an important study that has implications for all of us, whether we work in the Jewish community or simply identify as part of it. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank
It was
you.
a real pleasure to do this, and I was so happy to speak to a St. Louis community. And like I said, I hope one day I can come there and eat Ted Drew's with all of you or something like that. So thank you so much, and
Thank you,
have a
Ben.
good rest of your week.
Okay,
Thanks,
thank
Ben.
you. You too. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.